Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. It's the nighttime edition. It's Tim Travels After Dark. I'm your host Terry. So what the heck time is it here? Let me look on the so it's around 2300 on Thursday. So I did my drop this morning of my ice cream load. That went great. Like live unload done in under an hour. Like from the time I got to the facility till I was gone, it was like 48 minutes. So that was cool. I thought I was going to have a claim because when I opened up the trailer, there was a whole pallet of stuff that had kind of like tipped over because it was not loaded correctly. They didn't put any of the dunnage bags in it. There were no load bars, but you know, I got the trailer when it was already sealed. So but they were cool. They were just like, yeah, it's fine. So that was great. I did just pick up a load at General Mills. It's going over to the Cleveland area, and I'll be over there at like 7 in the morning. So kind of working the night shift. So little kind of like personal history. I wanted to tell you, I was thinking about both of these men that I'm going to tell you about today for different reasons. But I'm going to tell you about two guys that I probably will never forget because I knew them both personally. And I went to church with both of them, and they really kind of embodied the American experience, if you will, in the mid 20th century. And they both were products of the Depression, of World War II. Like all of those things were very formative and kind of, you know, informed their decisions and stuff like that. So I'll tell you about the older of the two gentlemen, and how I knew him and what I think is cool about him. And he's not in the history books, but maybe he ought to be. So when in 1992 I took orders to a ship that was in pre-commissioning status, and it was the USS Warrior. And it was an Avenger class MCM that was being built in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. Sturgeon Bay is, if you're familiar with Wisconsin at all, it's that little peninsula of land that sticks out into Lake Michigan, so kind of northeast of Green Bay. And the ship was being built at a place called Peterson Builders, PBI. And Peterson, this class of ships was going to be 14 ships, and Peterson was building 11 of them because the Navy wanted competition on this MCM class. And I think I said this was back in 92, but because they wanted competition on this MCM class, they basically told Peterson Builders, hey, you have to teach another shipyard how to build these things so we can give some other shipyard some contracts to show that there's some competition. And so Peterson guys basically showed Marinette Shipbuilding, which is over in Marinette, Wisconsin, which is kind of on the other side of Green Bay, if you will, how to build the ships. And Marinette built 3 of them. So anyway, I go up to Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, and I was still single, although my wife and I were getting ready to get married that summer. But I go up to Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, and by the way, Door County is a lovely area. A lot of people have vacation homes up there. It's just gorgeous. But anyway, I go up there and I start going to church up there, and I meet a man who's pretty elderly by this point, and his wife, and this guy's name is Fred Peterson. And Fred was the guy that founded Peterson Builders. Now, the company at the time I was there was run by his son. But Fred was this interesting guy, right? And he was already an adult by, like he just missed, I think, the First World War. And he came, and he lived in Wisconsin, lived in Door County, and so he started working as a shipwright, carpenter, whatever you want to call it, and building boats. And a lot of boats and ships were built on the Great Lakes back then. And so Fred worked at a shipyard, and during the Depression, he decided he wanted to start his own shipyard because he felt like he could do it better. And so Fred went to a bank in Green Bay, and excuse me, Green Bay was not that close, right? Fred goes to a bank in Green Bay and says, "Hey, I need to borrow," and it was not a lot of money. Back then it was a lot of money, but it was some pittance. It was like $800 or $1,000 to start this shipyard, right? And they're like, no, sorry, that's a bridge too far. So Fred doesn't do well with no. So he goes back to Sturgeon Bay and he scrounges up the money anyway, and he starts this shipyard. Well, he starts Peterson Builders. Well, by the time that World War II rolls around, Fred's shipyard is cranking out ships and building stuff, and it's very successful. And they built tons of ships for the Navy and the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II. But Fred was this unique guy because I didn't tell you that he basically only had an 8th grade education. He was just one of those guys that could invent stuff and fix stuff and do whatever. Like if there was a problem, he could figure out how to do something about it. And so when the Bank of Green Bay, and this is the excellent way to hold a grudge. The Bank of Green Bay eventually expanded and opened up branches in other towns around the region. And when they decided to open a bank branch in Green Bay, Fred was still incensed that all those years earlier, they wouldn't give him a loan. But by this time, Fred was like a millionaire. And so Fred decides to start his own bank, and he starts the Bank of Sturgeon Bay just to compete with the Bank of Green Bay. Now, if you say, well, this guy, he just held a grudge. He was one of those guys that, like I said, he didn't do well with no. So, and I'm kind of telling these stories out of chronological order, but it kind of illustrates the kind of guy he was. So, Sturgeon Bay, there's a shipping channel that goes out into Lake Michigan. So Sturgeon Bay is a body of water, in addition to being the name of the town, that comes off of Green Bay. But it's a bay, it's not a river. And so they built a shipping canal from the end of the bay through the Door Peninsula to connect Lake Michigan. It's like a shortcut around that peninsula. Well, so when they did that, they had to build bridges. And years ago, there was only one bridge. There's now two. And it was like one of those turntable bridges that would turn to let ships go through. Well, one time the bridge got stuck in the open position, and everybody north of the bay, so most of Door County, most of the peninsula, was isolated. And so Fred, in order for trucks to move and bring groceries to people, and even though a lot of people are dairy farmers and stuff, but people needed other things. People needed to get around, right? Because the town is actually on both sides of the water, because there was an old town called Sawyer to the south. So Fred gets a bunch of pontoon boats or pontoon bridge boats and just hooks them up, and he creates his own bridge while he waits for like the state to get the main bridge fixed. But this is a guy, he didn't care that, you know, the state was responsible for it. He's just like, oh yeah, I got some boats, and he just hooked them up and did a pontoon bridge like you see in World War II movies. That's one story. He lived on a place called Utopia Circle in Sturgeon Bay, and I'm sure it's still there. But that whole, like, it's like a little cul-de-sac, or I mean a little circle comes out, and there's some nice houses there. And but Fred, that's actually land that Fred created. Like, he just filled it in and made land on the water. And he designed houses. He started the first grocery store in town. And I'm going to tell you one more story about him, because I just thought he was a neat guy. And so after World War II, he had a design, he had a ship engineering. I'm actually going to tell you 3 more stories. So he had a ship engineering entity down the coast towards Milwaukee. So I can't remember if it was down in like Sheboygan maybe. But anyway, so those guys did all this design work for these, all these boats that they built in World War II. But after the war, they weren't really needed. But because Fred was so loyal to his employees, and by the way, people were so loyal to him, he was like, well, we're just going to keep this open, this design facility open, this naval architecture facility, and we're going to just, you know, work on projects. And he kept that open, and he employed everybody until they left or retired. And one of the things that they did, so that's story number 1. One of the things they did is, well, actually, I'm going to come back to that. So another story about Fred, and again, this is a guy who doesn't take no for an answer. A ship ran aground down south towards Milwaukee, and they were going to scrap the ship in place. And of course, because he was in the maritime industry, Fred kind of knew everything that was going on the Great Lakes, especially on Lake Michigan. And so he gets a hold of the people that own the ship and says, hey, you know, how much you want for the ship? And they basically quote him the scrap value of the ship. That's all they wanted for it. He's like, okay, I'll buy it from you. And they're like, fine, because then they're just like, they're done with it, right? But Fred had gone down in a boat and looked at how the ship was aground, and he realized that she wasn't really hard aground, but that, you know, he thought he could get her back into open water. So once he gets title to the ship, he gets a bunch of tugboats, and they go down there, and what he does is he you know, ties up the stern to one of the tugboats and just has that tugboat just, you know, tension it up but not try to pull it. And then he gets all the rest of the other tugboats and he backs them up right to the hull of the ship and just has them go to power and just stir up the water and all the sand that's under the ship. And in so doing, basically blasts all the sand that the ship is aground on out from underneath the hull till the tugboat that's got that stern line can pull her off and into deeper water. And so he saves the ship, you know, and turns around and resells it at a profit. And then the last story is coming back to the design facility. So Fred with his designers designs this 61-foot sloop, and he wants to build this thing. And for some reason, he took the plans to these naval architects in New York City, and they're like, "Hey, this thing is not going to work." And so he's like, oh yeah, watch. And he builds this ship, and or this sloop, and basically sails it around the world himself. He hires crew and sails it around himself. Now, for that feat, Fred was actually in National Geographic magazine back in the 60s. He was arrested in a couple of countries, or at least one country, I think, in Indonesia, because they thought he was a spy. They're like, how's this guy just sailing around the world? But this is a guy, a real life guy, not an imposing dude, just American ingenuity, stick-to-itiveness, and just, never taking, the easy way or taking no for an answer. So anyway, that's the story of Fred Peterson. I'm going to actually come back to the other guy later so we don't go too long here. But I wanted to talk about something I saw on CNN Business today. And I'm going to hold this up because I made a little note here. So there's this guy named Thomas Harman who basically wrote an op-ed piece. And he's with a company called Balsam Hill. And he wrote this op-ed piece about the logistics system, the supply chain, etc. And apparently Balsam Hill makes, or they don't make, they buy high-end plastic Christmas trees and other decorations from plants in China. And then they sell them here in the States. So obviously he has to get stuff put into containers, put on a ship in, Jinbo, wherever it's coming from in China, right? Across the Pacific, get it put on a rail car, get it brought to wherever their distribution center is by a truck. Then, they put stuff back in, I don't know if they use UPS or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But he's really super concerned about supply chain disruptions. Why? Because he's not going to have enough product to sell people. And he's lamenting the fact that there are all these supply chain issues. And so, because he's entrepreneurial and a free enterprise kind of capitalist guy, his idea is to have the U.S. government create a position of a supply chain czar. And apparently he's not he doesn't understand how the U.S. government works, but his idea is the czar will be empowered to basically make all these decisions that other entities already make, like the Surface Transportation Board, the FMCSA. So he wants to just grease the skids, change the hours of service requirements, make all these temporary changes, basically so his company can make a bunch of money, by the end of the year, because Christmas time is in their, it's their wheelhouse, right? And I'm like, wait a minute, dude. But then he says, but after everything's back to normal, we would abolish the position of the czar. And I'm like, so you want to appoint somebody? He wants the government, the president, to appoint somebody because he can't get his stuff on time, or in the quantities he wants, and shipping costs are going through the roof. And I'm reading this and I'm like, you know what, dude? Here's a better idea. If you don't like the trans-Pacific, transcontinental shipping debacle that's going on right now, why don't you do some crazy shit like, I don't know, make your products here in the United States? Like set up a factory, hire people to work in it, and pay them a good wage so they'll be happy to make as many plastic Christmas trees as people want to buy, and then just sell them. That's kind of a novel idea. I know people don't really think of that. And the thing is, I think Americans will pay for quality. A good example, going back to Wisconsin, is Allen Edmonds. I own several pair of their shoes, probably like a dozen pair of their shoes. Dress shoes, dress casual, you name it, right? They're in Port Washington, Wisconsin. Their shoes all cost like $350 a pair. I love them. And it's a great company to work with. Great customer service, great products. You know, I used to wear a suit 6 times a week. I have a lot of dress shoes, and they last forever. It's like buying a Rolex or something, right? Quality doesn't cost, you know, it pays. And so this guy could make his Christmas trees right here in America, and he wouldn't have to worry about being charged because he can't get a container turned around soon enough. He wouldn't have to worry about whether Union Pacific or BNSF can get his crap out of the Port of Los Angeles or the, you know, Port of Tacoma or Oakland or wherever it's coming in. He wouldn't have to worry that, you know, there's going to be one dude at a port in China that gets COVID and they shut down the port for 2 days. He could just make his Christmas trees here. But the other thing that I think is interesting too is that he wants the government to relax safety regulations, which hours of service requirements are, just so he can make a buck. In other words, he's willing to endanger the motoring public of America because he's not going to be able to sell enough. And, you know, I think people need to start getting the point that it's not, you know, capitalism and how this guy wants to do business is not the right way to do it. There are lots of great ways to do business, but this isn't one of them. You know, relax safety rules when it's convenient for him. You know, not manufacture in the United States, but then want the United States government, which is another way of saying the United States taxpayers, to come up with a solution for his free enterprise capitalist problem. What he doesn't understand is this is the market, bro. This is the market. These are market forces. You don't like the shipping rates? Then don't ship stuff. Or pay more and then try to pass it on to your customers. That's the American way. But you can't have it both ways. You either like the system that we have that I'm sure has made you quite wealthy, or you don't. But you're not going to get government intervention to help you have a bigger Christmas bonus. You know, open a factory. Okay, there's lots of people in this country that can handle making plastic Christmas trees, and you can pay them well, and people will probably still buy your products, and you cut way down on your shipping costs because you don't have to get a container on a ship from China. You know, and you don't have to wait for a stevedore to unload it at the Port of Los Angeles. And you don't have to wait for railroad people to load it on a train and train engineers and conductors to bring it somewhere so a truck driver can take it to your warehouse. I don't know, maybe they don't even have warehouses. Maybe they're a drop ship company like Wayfair is. Anyway, that's my editorial for today. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. But, you know, I will say this from a trucking perspective. I think the last half of this third quarter and the fourth quarter are going to be very lucrative. If you drive a truck and you can stay out late into the holidays, especially if you're, you know, working for Prime, moving refrigerated stuff, I think it's going to be pretty lucrative. And I'm actually trying to plan around that right now, trying to figure it out, how to make it all work. So anyway, good talking with you. Stay safe, and thanks for tuning in to Tim Travels After Dark. Bye.